really, really important part of the conflict. And I think that this is why, at least for periods of time, the war in Ukraine was able to capture the imagination of the Western public, precisely because the Ukrainians were able to speak for themselves. And this starts kind of from the top, right? This starts with the Ukrainian government, right, demanding a seat at the table, right? Again, kind of for me as a historian, and especially as a historian of the 20th century, kind of when we look at major conflicts in the past, what we see often, right, is that important decisions get made by the superpowers, whoever the superpowers may be at that particular moment in time. And countries like Ukraine, right, get to sit and wait, they get to wait their turn. They get to have decisions made for them, right? And we see this, we see this with World War II. World War II obviously is the best example. Is the best example of this. And I think that the Ukrainian government, right, and of course Zelensky in particular, right, has been extremely successful and extremely effective in making sure that Ukraine is not being talked about, that decisions are not being made about Ukraine, but that Ukraine is at the table, either a metaphorical table or a literal table. Anytime important decisions get made about Ukraine, what should Ukraine be doing, right? So that has been very important, right? And that translates all the way down, right? Ordinary citizens, a lot of cultural figures, right? Who are utilizing their specific expertise, whether it's musicians, whether it's filmmakers, whether it's artists, right? Really working hard to utilize existing platforms to be able to make sure that their voices, their songs, their music, their art, are going to be seen by the rest of the world, and the West in particular. So certainly, and another way that this has played out, and I think that there are a lot of people in Ukraine who are very very. I mean, there's a reason why people in Ukraine have a strong historical consciousness. There are a lot of very interesting and fascinating things that happened to Ukraine over the course of its entire history, but certainly over the course of the 20th and early 21st century. But there's a very, very strong historical consciousness and the recognition that there's things that are happening right at this moment, and they're important to address. But there's also a need to maintain and preserve a historical record of the events, whether the events are the heroism of the Ukrainian people or the atrocities and the war crimes that are being committed by the Russian military, and the painstaking ways in which people in Ukraine are collecting that information, all with the hope that when the war ends, there will be some kind of justice, right? That there will be trials for war criminals. And for me, as a historian of the 20th century and somebody who studies the Holocaust, I mean, it's very, very interesting to see that, right? That in previous conflicts, I think victims often did not want to talk about their experiences, whether because there was no language to describe the horrors that they experienced, or because of the trauma that they experienced, or because there was simply no opportunity, nobody wanted to hear their stories. People just kind of wanted to move on. And the interesting thing that we see in Ukraine is people being very conscious about, we need to preserve this. No matter how traumatized, the survivors feel many survivors feel a responsibility that regardless of how traumatized they are, they can't not talk about this. They can't not collect this information, and in the hope that this information can be used to. You can never bring back the dead, but at least you can try to achieve some kind of justice for them. And so that's, I mean, again, another illustration of that effort, right, to preserve voices, to be heard, especially when there's so many other things in the world competing for the West's attention. And ultimately, I think the thing that Russia, Putin in particular, right, but the Russian government is counting on, is that people will look away. Right. I mean, that's really the only thing that would allow Russia to win this war, whatever win means at this point in time, is if we get bored and we look away. And so Russia realized this, and that explains so much of Russian foreign policy. Ukraine realizes, and that adds to that desire to testify, right, to collect the information, to reach out and to be heard, rather than to wait to be invited, to be heard.
That is such an interesting difference from what I've seen in wars in the past that Ukrainians are making sure that even though it's traumatizing for themselves and they're reliving atrocities, that they still have that strength and power and absolute desire to make sure that they are still um, being heard and being supported in any way that they can. Um, this comes more from probably a place of not knowing on my side, but I've always struggled with kind of the historical context of why this war, why Ukraine. So I was wondering if you could provide some more insights just based on the Russian powerhouse to kind of put into context why now and what propaganda they've been really pushing within their own country to justify the war.
That's a really great question. Um, Probably if we start with why did Russia invade Ukraine? Ultimately, the first thing that we have to mention is Putin. And his decision-making process. Putin is on record as stating that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century is the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin is getting up there in age, and as any good authoritarian leader, he's thinking about sort of what has he been able to accomplish and what his legacy is going to be. And the restoring of the Russian Empire in some form is definitely very high on his list of priorities. And Ukraine, an independent Ukraine that dares to believe that they are an independent country and not simply an appendage of Russia, is definitely one of the things that bothers Putin. Um, the assumption, and this is where the dangers of being an authoritarian leader is you start to believe your own hype. The underlying assumptions, right? The war was supposed to last 3 days. The assumption was that the Russian military was going to kind of roll in and take over very easily. And it's important to know that there were a lot of people in the West who thought the same thing, right? The assumption that of course an authoritarianism means strength, right? There are plenty of people in the West, in the United States, who, with an affinity for a figure like Putin, maybe not all the little details, or maybe some of the details, but certainly just this idea, right, that this is an example of powerful masculinity, powerful leadership, and so of course this is something that was going to result in a military victory. The reality is that the Russian military is not nearly as strong as they thought it was, and that has been demonstrated time and time again, right? Sort of from day one of this particular war, and in many ways, right, it has been utterly humiliating for Russia, right? Its claims to superpower status hinging on its military power, and that's something that has been utterly mortifying. And kind of in parentheses, one of the interesting things that we see in the West, right, these conversations. Well, we can't let Ukraine win because it will embarrass Putin even more, right? We need to give Russia something so that Putin is not embarrassed, right? And the very fact that this is a kind of the logic, right, that the fragile ego of a male authoritarian leader has to be taken into account in thinking about how a country, right, should be handling its independence, right, and its war effort, arguably says more about us than maybe Ukraine. But going back to the why, right? The assumption is this is going to be easy. Ukraine, as an independent state that dares to think that they are an independent state, will be erased, and this is something that is going to kind of add to Putin's glory and the glory, of Russia. As far as how this was justified, this is actually kind of a really interesting thing that has been happening. One, I think there are a lot of people in Russia. Historians, political scientists argue over quite how many, right? How many good Russians are there? How many, Putin supporters, are there? And so it's a fascinating conversation. But ultimately, I would say the majority of people in Russia also maybe they weren't necessarily. a genocidal war with their neighbor maybe wasn't super high on their list of priorities, but the underlying assumption that Ukraine is not an independent country, that Ukrainian is not, its own language, that they are just they're the Russia's little brothers who have gotten confused and decided that they're European and they need to be brought back into the fold. That is a relatively common assumption, right? On the part of a lot of people in Russia. So kind of the idea that, sure, why, kind of why not, right? Especially if it's going to be easy, why not bring them back into the fold? This is, this is confusing. It's confusing for everyone to have this independent, to have this independent country. What's been interesting is sort of the shifts, right, in the internal propaganda within Russia about this particular war. So in the beginning, and especially I think when when the assumption was that this was going to be kind of quick and easy, the original formulation was that Ukraine was full of Nazis, right? So there were a lot of Nazis there, sort of Nazis / NATO / US. Like, I mean, there's kind of a lot of word salad, right? I mean, again, I think we can ridicule the nature of Russian propaganda, but I think all of us, people who live in America and read the news, can appreciate the potential propaganda value of word salad, right? Where a bunch of words that have some particular connotation are kind of thrown to see if we'll get people kind of excited in a particular way. So Nazis, NATO, right? United States, Nazis need to be defeated, and when kind of the emphasis on the Nazis was very much because of kind of Russia's emphasis on the cult of World War II, right? Russia claiming sort of the mantle of victory in World War II from the Soviet Union to Russia. And so that language, we are fighting the Nazis, right? And also we were successful last time we did that, is something that fit reasonably well into a lot of the worldview of a lot of people in Russia, right? Again, I think one of the many miscalculations on the part of Russia is that Ukrainians also fought in World War II, right? So they also have their and what Ukraine has that Russia maybe doesn't is that Ukraine has two kind of parallel World War II narratives. They have the Soviet World War II narrative that a lot of people are very supportive of, right? That we defeated the Nazis. And they also have the Ukrainian nationalist World War II narrative, right? When we fought the Nazis and the Soviets, right? So regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, you have a World War II narrative that you can also tap into, right, for propaganda purposes. And motivation. And so the Nazi thing lasted kind of for a while, and eventually it just became harder to maintain, right? It was confusing, it was hard to maintain, and so there was kind of this almost overnight, and I say this because I was one of the things that I was doing, right, is I was kind of following Russian media, including just kind of including social media, because I was very interested to see how the war was being presented and kind of sold to the Russian-speaking population. And so almost overnight, it switched from we're fighting the Nazis to we are fighting against, I mean, I'm trying to remember exactly how it was phrased, but the idea was that Ukraine was not, the Nazis were bad enough, right? But Ukraine, because of NATO, US, Western influence, was also pushing a pro-LGBTQ agenda, and they were going to bring that into Russia and ruin Russia, and therefore the war needed to be fought to save Russia from this nefarious, vague LGBTQ agenda that was out to get the children and whoever else. And again, right, moral panic about the dangers of the LGBTQ agenda is not something that is unique to Russia, right? It is a reasonably effective strategy that's deployed by a lot of politicians, right, and political forces for a variety of reasons. And so, but the switch was almost kind of overnight, right, where it went from we're fighting the Nazis to they are going to make all they're going to come to Russia and they're going to convert all your children into whatever the scary thing was going to be. And so that lasted for a while, and I think that was reasonably effective. Again, most recently though, it feels like Russia has given up on trying to have any kind of crusade dimension to the conflict, and in large part because nobody a 3-day war where a three-day genocidal war against your neighbor, sure, fine, whatever, right? A year and a half genocidal war against your neighbor that is making it harder for you to travel to Europe and get first and see Western movies in movie theaters. That's a completely different story. And so there's a bit of a shift that we've seen in Russia, where for example, so if you look at so a lot of I think during the early phases of the war, the Russian government was deploying a lot of social media influencers to push these ideas, right? So like you basically have kind of mommy bloggers, right? Blah blah blah, baby food, blah blah blah, Nazis in Ukraine, kind of just shifting kind of back and forth, and that seems to have disappeared, right? There's kind of this idea that this is no longer a thing we want to draw attention to. It's just this thing happening in the background while we're trying to live our normal lives. But when you look at recruitment videos, for example, the shift has been kind of, why are the Russian soldiers there? The recruitment videos don't emphasize the Nazis. They don't emphasize anything else except, ooh, when we win, you can buy an apartment in Kiev. And that's going to be really awesome because Kiev is really beautiful, right? So like we've gone completely from some kind of a moral crusade. Again, not horrific, fake moral crusade, but at least it's being framed as a moral crusade. So just completely like, hey, there's this thing, but what an amazing professional development opportunity, right? And what an amazing enrichment opportunity this is going to be, right? Once we win this particular war, right? So that shift has been kind of really, really interesting, and I think in part perhaps it's the Russian government preparing for the possibility of kind of a long, of a prolonged conflict, which again comes back to the best hope for Russia is that we get bored and we look away, and I think that explains Russian propaganda in the West. The kind of Russia as an agent of chaos, right? Because the most important thing is that Russia has not been able to persuade enough people in the West that their cause is just, right? The best they can do is get people to focus on other things, and so having horrible things happen elsewhere is something that benefits Russia tremendously, right? And so Russia invests in that sort of thing to make sure that there are other horrible things happening around the world, to make sure that Ukraine is not the focus, and Russia's genocidal activities in Ukraine are not the focus.
So what happened to change, I guess, the West stepping up and the stories from Ukraine coming out? Because, 2014, Crimea, and you had all those poisoning of ex-Russian agents in the UK. And yes, it was talked about, but there was no big stand-up of the West. It was like, oh, this is a little problem. They were even meddling in the Middle East. Why now has everything coalesced and really gone against Russia? Like, is it just Ukraine's administration forcing themselves at the table? Is it any change in the West that you saw? America's place maybe in geopolitics, it's not as stable as it was back in 2014?
I think, and again, it's hard for me not to think about it in the historical context. I think that 2014, so looking at it from Russia's point of view, I think 2014 was a trial balloon, right? If the West responded differently in 2014 to the annexation of Crimea, it is highly unlikely that Russia would have been in any position to invade Ukraine in 2022. But I think that and this comes back to what are the valuable lessons learned from past historical disasters, right? And so if we're looking at events like World War I, World War II, right, as our historical precedents for how to conceptualize Crimea and then the invasion of Ukraine, right? The invasion of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea. Okay, how much is the West willing to sacrifice for the sake of a small piece of land, right? That, well, there are Russians living in Crimea, there are Russians living in Crimea, right? Do we really know who Crimea belongs to, right? We do. I mean, but and so I think it was easier, rather than kind of risk, right? So are we willing to, we the West, right, willing to risk direct conflict with Russia that, many believed was strong and powerful, and at that time there was less evidence of how, unstrong and unpowerful they really are, especially militarily, all because of this small piece of land. And this kind of thinking about historical examples, right? So this concern, like the West getting sucked into conflicts that are not really about them because of border disputes that people over there constantly are having, and this is just another one of them. I think what changed for me, what I believe had changed for 2022 is that Russia did not appear to, Russia's aims were unlimited, appeared to be unlimited, right? So this was no longer just about Crimea, but I think it was also, NATO's moment to shine as well. By 2022, a lot of other former Soviet republics were now members of NATO, and so to them, Russia invading Ukraine, right? I mean, if we look at the level of support provided by different European countries, right, and different members of NATO, there's a lot, the feelings are significantly stronger in places like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, right, than they are in some of the, Western European countries. And that's because people in those countries and leaders of those countries, understand very well what it means, right, to not do something when Russia is trying to invade. And so I think that, kind of that realization, right? That realization that essentially appeasement, which I think is a term we can use to apply to Crimea, once again, did not work. And at this point in time, kind of what do we do? Not doing anything about it would be seen as deeply problematic. So that's kind of general Western rationale, but I think the Ukraine at the table thing becomes very, very important as well. There are these great photographs from some of the first weeks of the war, right, where, different, leaders of different, Eastern European countries visited Kiev, right, and met with Zelensky at and there are these pictures of them at tables, right, and I mean, realistically, right, it's 2022. People could have zoomed in, right? I mean, we had the technology. They could have accomplished, like, the content goals, right? If purely content goals could have been easily accomplished through a Zoom conversation that would have probably been safer for everyone concerned. But that symbolism, right? That in 1938 and 1939, right, decisions were being made about, Eastern European countries, right, by the superpowers, and decisions were, well, for the sake of peace, for the sake of maintaining the prestige of superpowers, smaller countries are going to have to make some sacrifices, right? We see this kind of almost like a revolt of smaller countries, right? Consciously coming together that we are going to be making these decisions, right? That the West is not going to decide whether Ukraine should be sacrificing a chunk of its territory to placate Putin and to put an end to the war. That these decisions are going to be there, and then of course the military success of Ukraine. Certainly, everybody likes a winner. So I think certainly the military successes of Ukraine helped present their cause as not a hopeless one, right? But one that's worth investing in, and that's worth supporting. Did that answer your question? So. Other questions? Oh yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good. With the Western's aid with Ukraine, would you say that would create a pocket for Eastern nations like China to strengthen ties with Russia, or with China strengthening ties with Russia? What opportunities do you see there for that happening?
that's a really great question. So I think one of the interesting things that we have seen since the war started is Russia becoming increasingly isolated with its not traditional, but I'm trying to think of how to say this. Um, because Russia views itself as a great European power, it's important for Russia to participate in meetings where other European leaders are there. And again, kind of, obviously this is a very Eurocentric view of the world, right? So again, we're taking it for granted. I'm kind of operating the assumption that that is what Russia believes is important, right? For them to be seen as a great European power. Russia is not getting invited places anymore. Also, technically, there's a warrant out for Putin's arrest for war crimes. So there are many European countries that probably, I mean, it's not clear whether every country would actually serve the warrant, right? But it's a potentially risky situation. And so what we've seen is Russia kind of really reorienting itself, right, in the direction of those countries that may be willing to be seen publicly with Russia and with Putin. And China is certainly one of them. North Korea is also one of them, right? And so the interesting thing about this, right, is that a lot of people who are critical, kind of Russian language critics of Putin, also operate in the same Eurocentric assumption, right? So while Putin is presenting himself as, oh, this is great, we're strengthening our ties to China, we're strengthening our ties to North Korea, we're strengthening our ties to Iran, there are a lot of people, kind of a lot of Putin's critics are building on that very Eurocentric assumption to say, ha, this is what kind of Putin is stuck with, having to make friends with North Korea and bragging about the fact that we're, BFF, he's BFFs now with North Korea, right? So again, there are some assumptions in play there, right? But it certainly does not make Russia look particularly strong and powerful, right? With North Korea is a special, fascinating case. With China, one of the interesting things that has happened is that because Russia is so hard up for allies and so hard up for resources that it desperately needs, right? I mean, one of the big problems that I think was everybody should have known about, but I think most people overlooked, right, is how economically weak Russia is, right? Russia has amazing natural resources, right? Russia is a superpower that makes its money from exporting raw materials, right? That is, I mean, again, if we're thinking about sort of economic power, superpowers don't export raw materials, right? That's not how these things work, and that's what Russia that's what Russia has, right? The Russian budget basically hinges on high oil prices, right? I mean, that's what allows Russia to be solvent, is high gas prices and high oil prices. And so one of the many things that has happened for Russia is the realization just how much of their economy hinges on things that from parts of the world that are no longer interested in trading with them. And it's big and important things like, parts for iPhones and cars, but it's also super mundane things like paper. Like, I mean, at one point in time, there was a paper shortage because paper came from, I want to say Finland, but maybe it wasn't, in any case, but definitely not Russia. So like there's not a domestic production of paper sufficient to cover Russia's paper needs, right? So like, printer paper, receipt paper, I mean, I kind of want to just really illustrate the mundane, both the sort of, again, iPhones and paper, right? And pretty much everything, and pretty much everything in between. And so in the relationship with, I think one could make the argument that Russia's relationship with China hasn't been a relationship of equals for a while. But I think China was maybe more willing to pretend that it was. China is no longer even interested in pretending that this is a relationship of equals, and Russia is acquiescing to that, right? So there are these meetings where Russia brags about the fact that China is there in providing support, and China certainly is willing to sell weapons and all sorts of other fun things, for Russia in the process. But in exchange, right? I mean, there's some really interesting questions about some territory that may change, that may change hands. But it's also just kind of official Russian propaganda emphasizing the need for Russia to embrace China, to be a vassal of China. There was one kind of op-ed that literally referred to Russia as a vassal of China, in a positive way, right? It's not a mainstream view, but it's the one that sort of is being floated by the Russian government, right, as kind of an option. Again, as kind of for social media, there are a lot of ads promoting dating apps that would match up Russian women with Chinese men, for example, right? I mean, again, it's a very interesting sort of social media approach to normalizing a very different kind of domestic reorientation. And again, the point is not to say, oh, that means that the Russian government is going to make Russian women, date men from China. But the fact that this is how this is being promoted as a desirable, a desirable and positive development is a shift, right? In the way that Russia wants to be seen and wants to present itself to the rest of the world, but also in the kind of social norms that are being kind of transmitted to people in Russia. So I think for China, it's an amazing opportunity. Russia is kind of, is getting what China is willing to give Russia at this point in time, because again, their options for allies are very very limited. Like I said, I mean, it's China, North Korea, Iran, and some countries in Africa where Russia has a special relationship with them because they provide military forces to help crush opposition, internal domestic opposition. And in exchange, those governments are happy to say nice things about Putin in exchange. Do we want to say anything about the movies? I feel I can obviously talk about Russian history and Ukrainian history forever and ever and ever. I feel bad about the movies. Yes.
Yeah, what did you think about the movies? Like, was there one that called you more, like, artistically, or?
There's one that really didn't call to me.
Really?
Sorry. Amanda and I chatted briefly about this beforehand. The second movie I found problematic in many ways. Again, ultimately, every story deserves to be told, every story deserves to be heard. But I don't know if this is necessarily a story that makes sense at this particular moment in time. The fact that I don't know if you were watching the credits, the fact that the credits for that particular short film, none of the names in there, right, are Russian names or Ukrainian names. So it's an interesting Western. I mean, the director himself is originally from Ukraine, but has been in the United States for decades. So it's an interesting kind of this both sides humanity, the triumph of humanity type message. I don't know. I mean, historically, it just doesn't quite make sense, right? That a Ukrainian speaking, because the subtitles didn't reveal this, right? But some of the people in the three films, right? Some people spoke Russian and some people spoke Ukrainian, right? So in the Captain Bravary movie film, everybody spoke Ukrainian. In the Mariupol documentary, some people spoke Russian and some people spoke Ukrainian. So the young woman with the thyroid, she spoke Ukrainian. The woman with the dogs and the son, they all spoke Russian. And their last name is Russian. So I think that's kind of interesting. The hedgehog one, you have a grandma who speaks a Ukrainian-speaking family whose daughter is in the territorial defense, whose husband may have been killed in territorial defense, who's harboring a Russian. I don't even know what he would count as, right? Because I literally could not figure out the kind of how he could have ended up in her backyard. Because the only way he could have ended up in her backyard if there were battles in the area and he got left behind in some way, right? And then kind of he stayed. Judging by the integrity of that house and everything around them, there's no way that there were actual battles going on in that particular space. There's just absolutely no way, right? So, and so if there were no battles in that vicinity, why would there be a random wounded Russian soldier who decides to hide out in her whatever it was, while bleeding, potentially bleeding out. So I like my, art, but I just could not wrap my brain around how any of it is plausible in any kind of, in any kind of reality. And so I don't know what the point. I just don't know what the point of it was. Plus the speech. I don't know if you guys caught it, right? But the speech that they have Zelensky's speech from March. So this action is taking place approximately 3 weeks after the invasion started, right? So the speech is March 15th. The invasion started February, in late February. So the speech specifically says, Russian soldiers surrender. We're going to treat you well. By that point, I mean, there's no evidence. So far, there's been no evidence that Russians who surrendered to Ukraine have been maltreated in any way, right? And so there's just no logic, right? Also statistically, right, the fact that they're Ukrainian speakers, the idea that they would, anyway, sorry. So that's, well, I guess I have a lot of feelings about that particular one. I mean, in the documentary, of course, I thought it was, was very poignant, and I think it really underscores, I think it's something we don't think about necessarily when we think about horrific things that happen, and atrocities and survivors, the role that luck plays in all of it, right? That just, I mean, and I think about this a lot, when when I do research on the Holocaust or when I teach the Holocaust, right? That that we have all these stories, right? But in the end, it's how much hinges on luck, right? The luck that the bomb hit here and not exactly here. Just so many, in order for people to survive, right? Through these horrific times, the kind of the elements of luck, that there's no logic here, there's no reason here, right? It's just horror that is being meted out by one country against against another, and the sheer luck that some people are able to survive, and of course then decide that they want to tell their story, right, on behalf of all those people who who were not better than them, who were not worse than them, but who were not lucky enough on any given day, right, and that responsibility to try to tell these stories, to try to give people a sense of what their what their life was like and what their experience was like. And at the end, right, when they talk about how do we know how many people died, right, that, I mean, the estimates on the death, right, is based on area covered by mass graves, right? That's a 20th century legacy right there, right? That we have violence and horrors and atrocities being committed on such a large scale that sometimes our ability to figure out how many people died is literally a math problem, right? How many bodies can you fit in a certain geographical area, and that's how we try to capture, the extent of death and death and destruction. So there was an online question: why doesn't any other person in the Russian government overthrow Putin and end the war? I'll be honest. So the first couple of days when the war started, there was footage, right, of Putin sitting there surrounded by his people, and he made speeches about the war, and everybody looked unhappy. I assume that what was going through their mind was, my villa in Italy. How will I get to my villa in Italy if there's a war or some such thing? But they did not look happy, right? But as the war went on, I think so for a period of time, I personally thought that if there was a successful assassination attempt, right, very early in the war, this thing could be turned around, right? That they could say, "Oops, it was a misunderstanding. Let's just pretend that this never happened, and move on." But I think what has happened since is that those people who looked unhappy, I don't know if they're necessarily super happy right now, but they're all in. right? There is not really a viable high-level opposition to Putin. There are a number of anti-war organizations. For example, one of the most interesting ones, I think, there's a feminist anti-war organization. Most of its leaders are not in Russia anymore. They had to leave Russia, and but they're continuing, they're continuing their work. What's interesting about that particular group, for example, is that to them, their anti-war effort is an extension of the anti-domestic violence efforts and various other initiatives that they were working on within Russia before the war started. And so they are continuing to they're utilizing the existing structure that they have, the networks that they have, to try to continue to speak out, but they do not have any political power in Russia. But as far as, and occasionally there might be some lower level, elected official who might say something, critical. I mean, the criticism would be more like, we're wasting money, we should be focusing on our problems instead of that. Do you know what I mean? And not sort of war is wrong or genocidal war is wrong, but more like, hey, all this money is being wasted. Let's focus on, let's focus on Russia. But realistically, there's not. And this is where the arguments about, are there good Russians? Who is anti-war, right? The people who are willing to speak out against the war are not in positions of power, and they're a tiny proportion of the population. There might be some people who are silently not super into it, but not willing to, speak out about it. But there's really nobody in the position to be able to overthrow Putin. Also, Putin is, if you've ever seen pictures of like Putin in meetings, right? It's usually like a table, a very long table. And so even his closest allies don't get to sit super close to him, just to make sure, right? I mean, again, if you're a long-term authoritarian leader, you develop some strategies, right, for dealing with potential threats on your life. Well, it's funny that you say that. I think, I don't remember, they didn't celebrate, at least it's possible that it was, but they didn't seem to promote it quite as much. But yes, it started with COVID, and there were all sorts of, again, obviously COVID impacted a lot of things, right? The COVID situation in Russia was also really, really, was really, really interesting. It was actually, sorry, do we have Okay, so the COVID situation in Russia is actually when people say, well, why won't people in Russia, protest? Why won't they criticize their government? So in late 2019, right? So pre our acknowledgement of COVID, right? There was a wave of protests in Russia against the government, and they were brutally put down by the police. And and most people on social media were cheering the heroic police in crushing these various people who the government was claiming that they were NATO agents, U.S. agents, whatever, and the people cheered on the crushing of their skulls, right? When COVID started and the Russian government tried to talk about the need for a vaccine, the need for various other measures, the same people who previously completely believed their government started saying, no, the government is lying to us. This is all a lie. This is all a conspiracy. To the point where Putin's official website, they had to take down some of the pro-vaccine, pro-COVID measures announcements, right? Because of the negative reaction that they received. When the war started, again, those same people who were previously yelling about the government lying to them, all in. The government is obviously telling the truth. Nazis, whatever's going on in Ukraine, we're behind our government. So literally COVID became the one moment where people were willing to criticize, arguably for problematic reasons. That was the moment where people were willing to not believe the government and think the government was lying to them. Anytime the government says we need to kill somebody, we need to beat somebody up, they deserve it, that appears to be something that most people are perfectly happy to fall in line with. But the COVID measures, that was really when public displays of how careful Putin was being, and that has continued. So I think same general motivation, right? The concern that his fear for his life and safety, right? And now translated to, because he would know that you can use chemical you can use chemicals and to poison people just by being in contact with them. So he certainly can appreciate the importance of keeping people at a safe distance, right? Whether it's it's a illness that they could spread to him or something more purposeful. So, but that was a great point.
And thank you so much. I know I learned a lot, and I hope all of us did as well.
The first movie was fine. Sorry, I just.
And to kind of comment the way in which that we tried to theme these together is you do with one of those films. It is a very westernized perspective of the war in Ukraine, and that very much so came through with you have to equally present both sides of the story and kind of make this fictionalized conflict between the families, and then the more documentary style was no, you're just actively seeing and witnessing what other people have gone through. And then one of the programming committees, one of their the interesting films was Captain Brewery, because you did get this fictionalized. People are still living. People are still trying to live their everyday lives with this huge other thing that is happening and cannot be escaped and is impacting life in maybe not so overt ways, but is constantly going on in the background. So that was kind of our perspective, to give a more full view of Ukraine from all of the different sides, or ways that you could take it, not sides.
And it wasn't a criticism. It was a criticism.
Oh no, yeah, no. We felt some ways about it as well, and it's like, oh, that's so interesting that they took this perspective. I mean, it was super westernized, and then you see more of the boots on the ground footage, and it's like, oh my gosh, to just contrast the ways in which storytelling is sparked by politics and what is happening with nation conflicts. It was very interesting.
But even sort of the house, right? The pristine house, right? That from the Hedgehog movie, right? Versus the apartment buildings that we see in Captain Bavari, right? I mean, these are just very different environments. Arguably one more realistic. Anyway.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer any other questions. I mean, kind of,
Yes.
I know you guys have to move on, but I'm happy to answer other questions.